All right, settle in, get comfy. Tonight we're going to journey back in time to a place called Colombia and hear about a fella named Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. He was born a long time ago, on December 1st, 1949, in a little town called Rio Negro, not too far from a big city, Medellín. Now, his daddy, Abel, was a farmer, and his mama, Hermilda, taught little kids in school. So, you see, he didn't start out with lots of money or fancy things. He was just one of 7 brothers and sisters, and even when he was just a little guy, people say he had big, big dreams. There's a story they tell. Maybe it's a bit of a tall tale, but it gives you an idea. He apparently told his pals that if he wasn't super rich by the time he was 22, he said something pretty drastic. It just shows how much he wanted to be somebody, even if his ideas were a bit mixed up. Growing up in Medellín, which was a busy, sometimes wild place, he didn't always choose the easiest or the right path. His first little adventures into mischief were small things, almost silly if they weren't leading to bigger troubles later on. Imagine this. He'd sneak into graveyards, take the old tombstones, sand off the names, and try to sell them again. Then he started selling cigarettes that weren't quite legal, and fake lottery tickets, and even got into taking cars. He was a young hustler, figuring out the ways of the street. He even tried going to university for a little while, but it wasn't really for him. He was learning different kinds of lessons, you see. He and his cousin, Gustavo Gaviria, who later became his closest partner in all his schemes, were always together, getting into scrapes. They started to get known in Medellín's shadier spots. It wasn't about drugs just yet, not in those early days. It was more about being clever, being daring, and meeting all sorts of people. This was back in the late 60s, early 70s, and Colombia was going through a tough time. Lots of folks didn't have much. The government wasn't always strong, especially in faraway places or the poorer parts of big cities like Medellín. This kind of place, in a way, was where someone like Pablo could find his footing. He saw chances where other people just saw problems. And he was very, very smart about how people worked. He knew how to get them to do things, sometimes by being nice, sometimes by being scary. These early years, the ones people don't talk about as much, were super important in making him the person who would later cause so much trouble, but also, strangely, be seen as a hero by some poor folks. It's a complicated story right from the start. He wasn't just a simple bad guy. He was clever and always planning, even back then, getting ready for something huge, even if he himself didn't know how huge it would be. He also worked for a big-time smuggler named Alfredo Gomez Lopez, who they called El Padrino. That means the Godfather. And that's where he really learned how to run big illegal businesses, how to move things around, how to pay people off, all the tricks he'd use later for something much more serious and dangerous. So, those early years were all about small crimes, learning from the big fish, and growing that powerful ambition that would define his whole life. Now, if you're settling in nicely and this story is catching your ear, maybe you can give a little tap on that like button later on. And if you'd like to hear more tales as we go, perhaps consider subscribing. It's always nice to know you're listening. So, as Pablo got a bit older, around the mid-1970s, something new started to happen. A different kind of powder, a white powder called cocaine, began to get really popular, especially up in the United States. And Pablo, with his sharp eyes for business, even shady business, saw a massive opportunity. It was like gold dust, but way more profitable. He wasn't the first one to think of it, of course, but he was one of the quickest to see just how huge it could be. He realized that the real money wasn't just in smuggling stuff like cigarettes or booze anymore. This cocaine thing was a whole different league. He started small, as you do. First, he was just a middleman, maybe buying coca paste from producers in Bolivia and Peru. getting it processed into cocaine hydrochloride in small, hidden labs in the jungles around Medellín, and then finding ways to get it to the people who could sneak it into the US. His early smuggling methods were pretty ingenious if you think about it, though definitely not something to admire. They'd use light aircraft, small planes taking off from hidden airstrips in the jungle, flying low to avoid radar, and dropping their precious cargo in remote parts of Florida or the Caribbean islands, where other teams would pick it up. Sometimes they'd hide it in all sorts of things. Inside spare tires, in shipments of flowers. Colombia is famous for its flowers, you know. Or even soak it into clothing, which would then be processed back into powder once it reached its destination. He was learning fast, and he was fearless. And he wasn't alone. Other ambitious traffickers were emerging around Medellín too, like the Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio Jr., who came from a family with a background in ranching and, some say, less legitimate businesses. There was also Carlos Later, a really flamboyant character, German Colombian, who was obsessed with John Lennon and, rather disturbingly, Adolf Hitler. Later was key because he had big ideas about using a whole island in the Bahamas, Norman's Cay, as a major refueling and transshipment point for cocaine flights heading to the US. Together, these guys, along with others like Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, nicknamed El Mexicano for his love of Mexican culture, started to work together. They realized that if they pooled their resources, their smuggling routes, their muscle, they could control the whole trade. And that's how the infamous Medellín Cartel began to form. It wasn't like a formal company with a CEO and a board of directors, not exactly. It was more like a loose alliance of powerful traffickers who collaborated when it suited them, carving up territories and sharing information and infrastructure. And Pablo, with his brains, his ruthlessness, and his ambition, quickly rose to become the most prominent figure, the first among equals, you could say. He understood the power of plata o plomo, silver or lead. It was a simple but terrifying choice he offered to anyone who stood in his way. Take a bribe, silver, and look the other way, or face a bullet, lead. Many, from police officers to judges to politicians, sadly chose the silver. Those who didn't often paid the ultimate price. His wealth started to grow at an unbelievable rate. We're talking millions, then tens of millions, then hundreds of millions of dollars. He was still a young man, barely in his late 20s, but he was already becoming one of the richest and most feared men in Colombia. And amidst all this rising chaos and empire building, he also found time for his personal life. In March 1976, when he was 26, he married Maria Victoria Henao Vallejo. She was only 15 at the time, which was quite a scandal, and her family reportedly disapproved of the match, probably because they knew, or at least suspected, what Pablo was really up to. But they got married anyway, and she would stay with him through thick and thin, through unimaginable riches and terrifying violence, right to the very end. They had 2 children together, Juan Pablo, who later changed his name to Sebastián Marroquín, and Manuela. So, you see, he was building not just a criminal empire, but also a family, trying to live some semblance of a normal life, even as the world around him was becoming anything but normal. Okay, so the Medellín Cartel, with Pablo pretty much at the helm, was now a well-oiled machine, churning out and shipping mind-boggling amounts of cocaine, primarily to the insatiable market in the United States. We're talking tons of the stuff. At its peak, it's estimated the cartel was responsible for something like 80% of the cocaine smuggled into the US. Imagine the logistics. They had fleets of planes, boats, even primitive submarines later on. They owned entire islands in the Caribbean that served as transit points. Norman's Cay, which I mentioned Carlos later set up, was a legendary spot. It had a refrigerated warehouse for the coke, houses for the pilots and personnel, and was basically a narco paradise, or hell, depending on your perspective. The money rolling in was just astronomical, almost impossible to comprehend. Forbes magazine even listed Escobar as one of the richest men in the world for several years running, with a fortune estimated in the billions. He had so much cash, they literally didn't know what to do with it. Stories abound of them burying it, hiding it in walls, or even having rats and water damage ruin millions because they couldn't launder it fast enough. They were spending something like $2,500 a month just on rubber bands to wrap the stacks of cash. Insane, right? But Pablo wasn't just about accumulating wealth for himself. He was also very clever about his public image, especially in his hometown of Medellín. He started cultivating this Paisa Robin Hood persona. Paisa is what people from Medellín and the surrounding Antioquia region are called. He would give money to the poor, build housing projects for slum dwellers. The most famous one being the Barrio Pablo Escobar, where thousands of previously homeless people got new houses, complete with pictures of him on the walls. He built football pitches, sponsored local teams, and generally made himself out to be a man of the people, a benefactor who cared about the forgotten communities that the government often ignored. And to be fair, for many of those impoverished people, he was a hero. They saw him providing things the state never did. Whether it was genuine altruism or a calculated move to buy loyalty and create a human shield, well, that's something people still debate, probably a bit of both. He understood that popular support could be a powerful weapon. This desire for acceptance and perhaps for immunity from prosecution led him to his next audacious move: politics. In 1982, Pablo Escobar actually got himself elected as an alternate member of the Colombian Chamber of Representatives as part of the Liberal Party. This gave him a seat in Congress, diplomatic immunity, and even a visa to the United States, which he famously used to take his family on a trip to Disneyland. Can you picture it? The world's biggest drug lord strolling down Main Street, USA. It's surreal. He saw politics as a way to legitimize himself and his fortune, and more importantly, to fight against the one thing he and other traffickers feared most: extradition to the United States. The U.S. justice system was much harder to corrupt or intimidate than the Colombian one, and they knew that if they ever ended up in an American prison, they'd be there for a very, very long time. So, no extradition became their rallying cry. However, his political honeymoon didn't last long. There were people in Colombia who weren't fooled by the Robin Hood Act and were deeply alarmed by the growing power of the narcos. One such man was Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the courageous minister of justice. Lara Bonilla started to publicly denounce Escobar, linking him to the drug trade and questioning the source of his wealth. He presented evidence, including a check Escobar had once written that was linked to a drug lab. This was a direct challenge, and Pablo, used to getting his own way, didn't take it lightly. The battle lines were being drawn. The Colombian state, or at least elements within it, were starting to push back, and the U.S., through the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, was increasing pressure on Colombia to crack down on the cartels and extradite the kingpins. The DEA had been aware of Escobar for years, but his brazen entry into politics really set off alarm bells. The easy days of operating with relative impunity were slowly coming to an end, and a much bloodier chapter was about to begin. The confrontation between Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla and Pablo Escobar reached a tragic and pivotal point on April 30th, 1984. Lara Bonilla was assassinated in Bogota, shot dead in his car by sicarios, young hitmen, on motorcycles, a method that would become chillingly common. His death sent shockwaves through Colombia and was a brutal declaration by Escobar and the Medellín Cartel. They would not be stopped, and anyone who stood in their way, no matter how high-ranking, was a target. This was a turning point. Before Lara Bonilla's murder, the government's stance against the cartels had been somewhat hesitant, riddled with corruption and fear. But killing a minister of justice was an act of war, and it forced the government, under President Belisario Betancourt, to take a much harder line. The no extradition clause in a previous treaty with the U.S. was effectively revived, and the crackdown began. Escobar, along with other major traffickers like the Ochoas and Rodriguez Gacha, had to go on the run. They briefly fled to Panama, where they even tried to negotiate a deal with the Colombian government, offering to pay off the national debt in exchange for amnesty and an end to extradition. Imagine the audacity. The government, under immense public and international pressure, refused. So the narcos returned to Colombia, but now they were fugitives, operating from the shadows, though still incredibly powerful. They formed a group called Los Extraditables, the extraditables, and their motto was, "We prefer a grave in Colombia to a jail cell in the United States." This was their declaration of war against the state, and they meant it. What followed was a period of horrific violence, often referred to as narco-terrorism. The cartel, primarily Escobar, unleashed a wave of bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings aimed at intimidating the government, the judiciary, and the press into backing down on extradition. Car bombs became a terrifyingly frequent occurrence in Bogotá, Medellín, and Cali. They targeted judges, police officers, politicians, journalists, anyone who spoke out against them or tried to enforce the law. In November 1985, a truly shocking event occurred: the Palace of Justice siege in Bogotá. Leftist guerrillas from the M19 movement stormed the Supreme Court building, taking hundreds of hostages, including most of the Supreme Court justices. The Colombian army responded with overwhelming force, and the resulting siege and fire lasted for over 27 hours. Over 100 people died, including 11 of the 21 Supreme Court justices. For years, there were strong suspicions, and later considerable evidence, that Escobar had financed the M19 operation. Why? Because the Supreme Court was at that very time deliberating on the constitutionality of the extradition treaty. With many of the justices killed and crucial records destroyed in the fire, including those related to extradition cases, it was a devastating blow to the justice system and, in a twisted way, a victory for Los Extraditables. The U.S., particularly the DEA, was getting more and more involved. They provided intelligence, training, and resources to the Colombian authorities. Agents like Javier Peña and Steve Murphy, whose story later became famous through the Narcos series, were on the ground working with Colombian police to track down the cartel leaders. But it was an incredibly dangerous and frustrating fight. The cartel had an extensive network of informants, and Escobar seemed to always be one step ahead. He had an almost mythical ability to evade capture, earning him nicknames like El Padrino, the Godfather, or El Mágico, the Magician. The violence was relentless. They blew up Avianca Flight 203 in November 1989, intending to kill presidential candidate Cesar Gaviria, who wasn't on board, though 110 innocent people were. They bombed the headquarters of the DAS, Colombian intelligence agency, in Bogotá, killing dozens. They offered bounties for dead police officers in Medellín, leading to the murder of hundreds of cops. Ordinary Colombians lived in a state of fear. Life became unpredictable. A simple trip to the shops could turn deadly if a car bomb went off. The country was teetering on the brink of becoming a failed state. all because of the insatiable greed of a few men and the cocaine they peddled. And Pablo Escobar was orchestrating much of this chaos, a shadowy figure pulling strings, all while trying to maintain his image as a man of the people in certain quarters of Medellín. The assassination of Luis Carlos Galán in August 1989, a charismatic presidential candidate who was a vocal opponent of the cartels and a strong proponent of extradition, was another earth-shattering event. He was gunned down at a political rally, and many believe Escobar personally ordered the hit. Galán was widely expected to win the upcoming presidential election, and his murder outraged the nation. It was like the narcos were trying to systematically dismantle Colombia's political future. The government, now under immense pressure, declared an all-out war. They reinstated extradition by decree and launched major offensives against the cartels. This is when the search bloc, Bloc de Búsqueda, was officially formed, a special elite police unit trained and often equipped by the U.S., whose sole mission was to hunt down Pablo Escobar and other top Medellín cartel leaders. They were tough, and they played rough. The war escalated. Escobar and his extraditables responded with even more terror. They detonated a massive truck bomb outside the DAS, Administrative Department of Security, Colombia's intelligence agency, headquarters in Bogotá in December 1989, killing around 70 people and injuring hundreds. The sheer audacity and brutality were shocking. They also continued their campaign of assassinating police officers in Medellín, paying bounties for each one killed. It was a dark, bloody time, but the constant pressure was starting to take its toll, not just on the country, but on Escobar's organization as well. His cousin and closest confidant, Gustavo Gaviria, who was considered the financial brains of the cartel, was killed by the search bloc in August 1990. This was a massive blow to Pablo, both personally and professionally. Other key lieutenants were also being killed or captured. The noose was tightening, slowly but surely. At the same time, another rival group was gaining power, the Cali cartel. Unlike the Medellín cartel's very public and violent approach, the Cali godfathers, Gilberto and Miguel Rodríguez Orejuela, along with Chepe Santa Cruz Londoño, preferred bribery and subtlety. They saw Escobar's war as bad for business, drawing too much heat on everyone. There were even rumors that the Cali cartel was secretly collaborating with the authorities and a shadowy vigilante group called Los Pepes, Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, to help bring him down. Los Pepes was made up of former associates, rivals, and victims of Escobar, and they waged their own brutal war against him, targeting his properties, businesses, and family members. So, Pablo was fighting a war on multiple fronts, against the Colombian state, against the DEA, against the Cali cartel, and against Los Pepes. It was becoming unsustainable even for him. He was still incredibly wealthy and powerful, but he was also a hunted man, constantly on the move, unable to enjoy his riches or see his family freely. This led to a surprising development. Escobar, through his lawyers, began to signal that he might be willing to negotiate a surrender. But he had conditions, big ones. He wanted assurances that he would not be extradited to the United States, and he wanted to serve his time in a prison of his own design. It sounds unbelievable, but the Colombian government, weary of the endless bloodshed and the crippling economic cost of the drug war, was actually willing to listen. Cesar Gaviria, who had become president in 1990, the very man Escobar had tried to kill on the Avianca flight, was in an incredibly difficult position. Continuing the war meant more deaths, more bombs. Negotiating with Escobar felt like a capitulation to a terrorist, but it offered a chance to stop the violence. After a lot of back and forth, a deal was struck. A new Colombian constitution was being drafted, and conveniently it included a clause prohibiting the extradition of Colombian nationals. This was a major win for Escobar. And then came the prison. So, about this prison, it wasn't just any prison. Pablo Escobar negotiated the right to build his own jail, and he chose a location high in the mountains overlooking Medellín. It was called La Catedral, the cathedral, and let me tell you, it was more like a luxury resort than a place of incarceration. He surrendered to the Colombian authorities in June 1991, walking into La Catedral as a prisoner, but a prisoner on his own terms. It was a spectacle. The government tried to spin it as a victory, saying they had brought the country's most notorious criminal to justice. But many Colombians, and certainly the US government, saw it for what it was: a sweetheart deal, a farce. La Catedral had a football pitch, a giant dollhouse for his daughter, a bar, a jacuzzi, a waterfall, and even a telescope so Pablo could look down on his beloved Medellín, and, some said, keep an eye on his family. He was allowed to choose his own guards, who were essentially his own men. He had access to telephones, computers, and fax machines, which meant he could continue to run his cocaine empire from inside his prison. He could receive visitors whenever he wanted. And those visitors often included fellow narcos, business associates, and, well, women for entertainment. There were reports of lavish parties, imported food and alcohol, and all sorts of contraband. The Colombian army was stationed outside the perimeter of La Catedral, supposedly to keep him in, but in reality, they were more like keeping other people out. They weren't allowed inside the actual compound. It was Pablo's private fortress. For about a year, Pablo lived this bizarre life. He was technically a prisoner, but he was living in luxury, surrounded by his loyalists, and still pulling the strings of his organization. The flow of cocaine continued, and so did the violence, albeit at a slightly reduced level now that the immediate threat of extradition was off the table. However, the situation couldn't last. Reports started to leak out about the true nature of La Catedral. The media, both Colombian and international, began to expose the scandal. There were stories of Escobar ordering the torture and murder of several of his own lieutenants inside La Catedral because he suspected them of stealing from him. Two of his top associates, Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Moncada, also known as Kiko, were lured to the prison and then brutally killed and dismembered on Escobar's orders. Their bodies were supposedly burned in the prison's incinerator. When word of these murders reached the government, it was the final straw. President Gaviria realized he couldn't let this charade continue. The government had been made to look like fools, and Escobar was clearly making a mockery of the justice system. The public outcry was growing, and the US was putting immense pressure on Gaviria to do something. So, in July 1992, the government decided to move Escobar to a real, maximum security military prison. They sent in a special army unit to transfer him, but Pablo, ever the master of staying one step ahead, got wind of the plan. When the troops arrived at La Catedral, they found it mostly empty. Pablo Escobar, along with his brother Roberto and a few loyal bodyguards, had simply walked out the back. He had bribed his way to freedom, or perhaps just used a pre-planned escape route. The escape from La Catedral was a massive embarrassment for the Colombian government and President Gaviria. The world's most notorious drug lord, who had supposedly surrendered, was now back on the loose. The hunt for Pablo Escobar was on again, but this time, the stakes were even higher. He was now a fugitive with no deals on the table, and the government was determined to get him, dead or alive. The search block was re-energized, and the US offered even more support, including sophisticated surveillance technology and intelligence operatives. The comfortable, king-like existence in La Catedral was over. Pablo was back to living in safe houses, constantly moving, trusting very few people. His vast empire was still functioning, but he was more isolated than ever before. The Pesa Robin Hood was now just a hunted outlaw. So, Pablo was out, back on the streets, or rather, hiding in them. The period after his escape from La Catedral in July 1992 was intense. The Colombian government, deeply embarrassed and under huge pressure, threw everything they had into finding him. The search block, that elite police unit, was reactivated with a vengeance, and this time, they weren't alone in their hunt. As I mentioned before, this shadowy group called Los Pepes, Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, emerged and became a major force. Los Pepes was a real wild card. It was an alliance of convenience between Escobar's rivals in the drug trade, particularly the Cali Cartel, paramilitary groups, and individuals who had personal vendettas against him, like family members of people he had ordered killed. They were ruthless, and they didn't play by any rules. They started systematically targeting anything and anyone connected to Escobar. They bombed his properties, killed his lawyers, his financial backers, his sicarios, and even went after his extended family. It was a dirty war, with atrocities committed on all sides. There's a lot of evidence, though often denied, that sections of the Colombian police and intelligence, and possibly even some U.S. intelligence assets, were tacitly cooperating with Los Pepes, feeding them information about Escobar's network. The logic, however brutal, was that Los Pepes were doing the dirty work that the official forces couldn't or wouldn't do, dismantling Escobar's support structure from the inside out. Escobar, in turn, retaliated with more car bombs in Bogotá and Medellín, trying to pressure the government to call off the hunt and protect his family. He was particularly desperate to get his wife, Maria Victoria, and his children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, out of Colombia to safety, possibly to Germany, but their attempts to flee were blocked. They were essentially under government protection, but also, in a way, hostages. The noose was definitely tightening around Pablo. His vast network of informants was being eroded by Los Pepes' terror campaign and by the authorities. His financial resources, while still immense, were harder to access. Many of his key lieutenants were dead or had surrendered. He was becoming increasingly isolated, moving between dingy safe houses in Medellín, often with just one or two bodyguards. He couldn't trust anyone. The search block was using sophisticated American surveillance technology to try and pinpoint his location, primarily by tracking phone calls. Escobar knew this, and he was usually very careful, making only very short calls or using couriers. But the pressure was immense, and he was known to be a family man, deeply attached to his wife and children. He desperately wanted to speak to them. The DEA and the search block were banking on him making a mistake. The hunt went on for 16 months after his escape from La Catedral. It was a period of intense fear and paranoia for Escobar. He reportedly dyed his hair and grew a beard to try and change his appearance. He lost a lot of weight. The flamboyant billionaire was reduced to a hunted fugitive, relying on a dwindling number of loyalists. One of his main bodyguards during this final period was Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, nicknamed El Limón, the Lemon. He was fiercely loyal. The city of Medellín, his city, became his cage. He knew the neighborhoods, the people, but now eyes were everywhere. The reward for information leading to his capture was huge, millions of dollars. The once powerful Medellín Cartel was crumbling. While other factions still operated, Escobar's central command and control was severely weakened. The Cali Cartel was more than happy to see him go down, as it would leave them as the dominant force in the cocaine trade. The end was drawing near, and everyone could feel it. The question was no longer if they would get him, but when and how. And Pablo, for all his cunning and resources, was running out of options and out of time. And so, it all came down to a single phone call. On December 2nd, 1993, the day after his 44th birthday, Pablo Escobar made a fatal mistake. He was hiding out in a middle-class house in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellín. He had been on the phone with his son, Juan Pablo, who was staying with his mother and sister in the Tequendama Hotel in Bogotá under heavy government protection, or surveillance, depending on how you looked at it. Escobar was, by all accounts, a devoted father, and he had been talking to Juan Pablo frequently, despite the known risks of phone tracing. On this particular day, he stayed on the line for too long. U.S. intelligence, working with the Colombian search bloc, had supplied advanced radio triangulation equipment. As Escobar spoke to his son, some say he was trying to comfort him, others that he was giving instructions or just desperate for contact. The electronic ears of the search bloc were homing in on his signal. They had been trying to get a lock on him for months, and this time, he gave them the opening they needed. Colonel Hugo Martinez, the leader of the search bloc, was a man obsessed with catching Escobar. His own life had been threatened countless times, and his family had lived under constant fear. He was determined to end Escobar's reign. Once they had a fix on the location, the search bloc moved in, fast and hard. They surrounded the house. Escobar was reportedly with just one bodyguard, Alvaro de Jesus Agudelo, El Limón. When they realized they were trapped, a gunfight erupted. Escobar and El Limón tried to escape by climbing out onto the roof of an adjoining house. It was a chaotic scene, gunfire echoing through the residential neighborhood. Details of what exactly happened on that rooftop have been debated for years. The official story is that Escobar and El Limón were killed in a shootout with the search bloc. Both men were armed and fired back. Escobar was hit multiple times, in the leg, the torso, and fatally through the ear, a shot that went through his head. El Limón was also killed on the rooftop. Photos from the scene are quite graphic. Escobar, bloated and barefoot, lying dead on the red-tiled roof. A stark contrast to the image of the powerful, immaculately dressed kingpin he once was. The members of the search bloc were jubilant, posing for photos with his body. For them, it was the culmination of a long, bloody, and personal war. Colonel Martinez, upon receiving confirmation that Escobar was down, famously said, "Viva Colombia! We have just killed Pablo Escobar." The news spread like wildfire. In Colombia, there were mixed reactions. For the government, the police, and the many victims of his terror, it was a moment of triumph and relief. The man who had held the country hostage for so long was finally gone. But in some of the poor barrios of Medellín, where Escobar had cultivated his Robin Hood image, there was genuine mourning. Thousands turned out for his funeral, a chaotic affair where some people wept and others tried to touch his coffin, seeing him as a fallen hero. The circumstances of that final shot have always been a bit murky. While the official version is that he was killed by the search bloc, Escobar's family, particularly his son, Juan Pablo, now Sebastián Marroquín, has long maintained that Pablo committed suicide, shooting himself in the ear, just as he had always sworn he would rather do than be captured or extradited. They point to the location of the fatal wound and his often stated preference. Others speculate that Los Pipes might have been involved in the final shootout, or that the fatal shot was an execution. The truth is, we'll probably never know for absolute certain who fired the very last bullet. What is certain is that on that afternoon, the reign of Pablo Escobar, one of the most notorious and wealthy criminals in history, came to a violent end on a rooftop in his hometown. The death of Pablo Escobar was a monumental event, not just for Colombia, but for the global drug trade and the fight against it. Immediately, there was a sense of a massive weight being lifted from Colombia. The daily car bombs, the assassinations of public figures, the constant fear that had gripped cities like Medellín and Bogotá. It was hoped that the worst of that was over, and in many ways, it was. The Medellín Cartel, already fractured and weakened by the time of Escobar's death, essentially disintegrated without its charismatic and ruthless leader. The remaining lieutenants were either killed, captured, or they faded away, unable to command the same level of fear or loyalty. However, the idea that Escobar's death would mean the end of the cocaine trade was, of course, naive. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does the underworld. The Cali Cartel, which had been patiently waiting in the wings and even, as we discussed, actively helping to bring Escobar down through groups like Los Pepis, quickly stepped in to fill the void. They were already a massive operation, but now they became the undisputed kings of cocaine. Their style was different, less ostentatious, more businesslike, relying on bribery and corruption rather than outright terrorism. They were known as the Cali KGB for their sophisticated intelligence and counterintelligence networks. So, while the spectacular violence associated with Escobar diminished, the flow of drugs to the US and Europe certainly didn't stop. In fact, some argue it became even more efficient and harder to combat for a while because the Cali cartel was more subtle. The US, which had invested so much in hunting Escobar, quickly shifted its focus to the Cali godfathers, Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez Orejuela and their associates. The fight just moved to a new set of opponents. In Colombia, the search block was disbanded shortly after Escobar's death, its primary mission accomplished. Colonel Hugo Martinez, who led the unit, became a national hero, though he and his family continued to face threats for years. The Colombian government could finally claim a major victory in the drug war, and President Cesar Gaviria's reputation was somewhat restored after the La Catedral fiasco. For the ordinary people of Medellín, life began to slowly return to some semblance of normality. The city had been scarred deeply by years of violence. The term Medellín had become synonymous with drugs and murder worldwide. Recovering from that stigma would take a long time. But the end of Escobar's terror campaign did allow the city to start rebuilding and healing. What about Escobar's family? His wife Maria Victoria Henao, son Juan Pablo, and daughter Manuela were in a precarious position. They were hated by many, seen as beneficiaries of blood money, and potentially targeted by Escobar's enemies who might seek revenge or try to seize his remaining assets. After his death, they initially remained in Colombia under government protection, but eventually managed to flee the country. They sought asylum in several places before finally settling in Argentina under new identities. Juan Pablo changed his name to Sebastián Marroquín and has since become a public figure of sorts, writing books about his father and speaking out against the violence of the drug trade, often expressing remorse for his father's crimes. He's tried to meet with the children of some of his father's most prominent victims, like the sons of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla and Luis Carlos Galán, in gestures of reconciliation. Manuela, his daughter, has remained largely out of the public eye. Escobar's vast fortune, estimated in the billions, became a subject of myth and endless speculation. Much of it was in cash, hidden in countless safe houses, buried in the ground, or laundered through various businesses and properties. The Colombian government seized a lot of assets, but it's believed that a significant portion was never recovered, either looted by former associates, rivals, or even by corrupt officials, or simply lost. The legend of Escobar's hidden millions still sparks treasure hunts in Colombia to this day. The influence of Pablo Escobar, even after his death, lingered in many ways, both tangible and intangible. One of the most immediate and visible impacts was on the landscape of the drug trade itself. With the Medellín Cartel dismantled, the Cali Cartel did indeed rise to become the dominant force for a few years in the mid-1990s. However, their reign was also relatively short-lived. The Colombian government, with continued U.S. support, eventually managed to arrest the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers and other Cali leaders. But the drug trade is like a hydra. You cut off one head, and others grow in its place. After the decline of the big centralized cartels like Medellin and Cali, the business became more fragmented. Smaller, more discrete organizations, often referred to as cartelitos or baby cartels, emerged. Paramilitary groups like the AUC, United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, and leftist guerrilla groups like the FARC, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, also became deeply involved in drug trafficking to fund their respective conflicts. So, the source of the cocaine didn't dry up. The structure of the organizations controlling it just changed. In terms of his cultural impact, it's been profound and often controversial. Escobar became this almost mythical figure, a subject of fascination worldwide. His life story, with its extremes of wealth, power, and violence, has been told and retold in countless books, documentaries, movies, and TV series, most famously Narcos. This has led to what some call narco culture, where figures like Escobar are sometimes romanticized or portrayed as anti-heroes. This is particularly troubling for many Colombians who live through the terror and feel that these portrayals can trivialize the suffering he caused. In Medellin, the barrio Pablo Escobar, the housing project he built, still stands. And for some residents there, he remains a revered figure. His grave in the Monte Sacro cemetery in Itagüí, near Medellin, has become a macabre tourist attraction. People leave flowers, notes, even reportedly requests for favors. It highlights the deep divisions in how he is remembered, as a monster by most, but as a benefactor by a persistent few. His legacy of violence also left deep scars on Colombian society and its institutions. The level of corruption he fostered within the police, judiciary, and political system took years to address, and some argue its effects are still felt. He showed how one man, with enough money and ruthlessness, could challenge the very foundations of a state. The sheer number of people killed during his reign, estimates range from 4,000 to 60,000, depending on who you count. Direct murders, victims of bombings, police officers, etc., left a legacy of trauma and loss for generations of Colombians. Think about the journalists who were assassinated for daring to report on him, like Guillermo Cano Izaza, editor of El Espectador newspaper. Their courage and the price they paid is also part of Escobar's dark legacy. Then there's the environmental impact. The vast coca plantations that fed his empire led to significant deforestation in parts of Colombia. The chemical precursors used to process coca into cocaine polluted rivers and soil. And let's not forget the hippos. Escobar, in his Hacienda Nápoles, had a private zoo with exotic animals, including 4 hippopotamuses. After his death, most animals were relocated, but the hippos were difficult to manage and were left behind. They thrived in the Colombian climate, escaped, and have now multiplied into a wild population of dozens, becoming an invasive species and a rather bizarre ecological problem. Cocaine hippos, as they're sometimes called. It's a strange, almost comical, but very real consequence of his excesses. So, his death wasn't a clean end. The ripples continued and continue to spread out. The United States' involvement in Colombia certainly didn't end with Escobar's death. The DEA continued to have a significant presence, shifting its focus to the Cali cartel and then to the newer, more fragmented trafficking organizations and the armed groups involved in the trade. Plan Colombia, a multi-billion-dollar aid package initiated in the late 1990s and early 2000s, primarily funded by the U.S., aimed to combat drug trafficking and leftist insurgencies, which were heavily funded by drugs. It involved military aid, equipment, training for Colombian forces, and controversial aerial fumigation programs to eradicate coca crops. The effectiveness and consequences of Plan Colombia are still hotly debated. Critics point to human rights concerns, environmental damage from fumigation, and the fact that coca production, while fluctuating, never disappeared. Supporters argue it helped weaken the FARC, strengthen the Colombian state, and reduce drug flows, at least temporarily. What's clear is that the war on drugs simply entered a new phase, with new battlegrounds and new adversaries. The fall of the big Colombian cartels also inadvertently helped pave the way for the rise of Mexican drug trafficking organizations. As the Colombian groups weakened and faced more pressure, Mexican traffickers, who had long been involved in smuggling Colombian cocaine across the U.S. border, began to take over more aspects of the supply chain, eventually becoming the dominant players in the Western Hemisphere's drug trade. So, the problem didn't go away. It just shifted geographically and structurally. For Colombia itself, moving on from the Escobar era was a monumental task. The country had to rebuild not just its infrastructure, which had suffered from bombings, but also its international reputation and the trust of its own citizens in their institutions. Medellín, in particular, embarked on a remarkable transformation. Once known as the murder capital of the world, the city has made significant strides in recent decades. It invested heavily in public infrastructure, education, and social programs, especially in poorer neighborhoods. Innovative projects like cable car systems connecting hillside slums to the city center, modern libraries, and parks have helped to integrate marginalized communities and offer alternatives to crime. Medellín is now often cited as a model for urban renewal, though challenges with crime and inequality certainly remain. But the city actively worked to shed the narco label and create a new identity. This involved a conscious effort to reclaim public spaces once dominated by fear and to foster a culture of peace and legality. However, the fascination with Escobar, as we've touched upon, creates a tension. While the city wants to move on, narco-tourism focusing on Escobar's old haunts, his grave, the ruins of La Catedral, the building where he was killed, is a persistent phenomenon, much to the chagrin of many locals and officials who feel it glorifies a criminal and overshadows the city's positive progress. The victims of Escobar's reign are, of course, a crucial part of his legacy. Their stories often get lost in the sensationalism surrounding the man himself. Thousands of families were torn apart, individuals were traumatized, and an entire generation grew up under the shadow of his violence. There have been efforts in Colombia to preserve the memory of the victims and to ensure that the horrors of that era are not forgotten or whitewashed. Museums and memorials have been established, and there's an ongoing societal conversation about how to come to terms with that dark period. It's a reminder that behind the almost mythical figure of Escobar lies a very real and very painful human cost. The economic impact was also complex. While Escobar's illicit billions distorted the Colombian economy in many ways, leading to inflation and making it difficult for legitimate businesses to compete, The cost of fighting him was also astronomical. Resources diverted to security, lost investment, damage to infrastructure. His operations also fostered a culture of easy money and illegality in certain sectors, the effects of which took a long time to unwind. Looking back, it's pretty clear that Pablo Escobar's story is a massive cautionary tale. It shows how a single individual, driven by insatiable greed and a complete disregard for human life, can rise from petty crime to challenge an entire nation. It also highlights the complexities of the drug war. Killing one kingpin, even one as powerful as Escobar, doesn't end the drug trade. The demand in consuming countries, particularly the US and Europe, remained high. And as long as there's demand, someone will find a way to supply it. The strategy of just targeting the head of the snake proved to be a temporary fix at best. The economics of the drug trade are just too powerful. The sheer amount of money involved corrupts everything it touches, from local police forces to high-ranking officials. Escobar perfected the art of plata o plomo, and that tactic, in various forms, continues to be a problem wherever organized crime flourishes. His life also forced Colombia, and perhaps the world, to confront uncomfortable truths about social inequality. Part of Escobar's early appeal, his Robin Hood persona, stemmed from the fact that he provided for communities that felt abandoned by the state. While his motives were undoubtedly self-serving, it underscored the deep social divisions and the need for governments to address poverty and lack of opportunity, lest desperate people become vulnerable to the allure of criminal leaders. The methods used to fight Escobar also raise questions. The rise of Los Pepes and the alleged collusion of some state actors with this vigilante group showed how, in the desperation to stop one monster, other monsters can be created or empowered. It was a classic ends justify the means dilemma, and the ethical lines became very blurred. The Colombian state was pushed to its limits, and some of the tactics employed in that war had long-lasting repercussions for human rights and the rule of law. What about the CIA's involvement? It's a bit murky, as these things often are. The primary U.S. agency on the ground working with the Colombians was the DEA. However, the CIA undoubtedly had intelligence assets in Colombia and was monitoring the situation closely, given the geopolitical implications of a major drug-producing nation potentially becoming a narco-state. There have been allegations over the years of CIA contacts with various players, including, some claim, individuals who would later form or assist Los Pepes. But concrete, declassified proof of direct CIA operational involvement in the hunt for Escobar, in the same way as the DEA is less clear-cut than their involvement in other Latin American conflicts or operations. Their role was likely more focused on intelligence gathering and analysis, sharing information with Colombian authorities and the DEA. The fight against Escobar definitely fostered much closer intelligence and security cooperation between the US and Colombia, a relationship that continued for decades through initiatives like Plan Colombia. Today, Pablo Escobar is more than just a historical figure. He's a brand, a symbol. For some, he symbolizes rebellion, albeit a twisted form of it. For others, he's the ultimate villain. The ongoing pop culture fascination ensures his name won't be forgotten. But it's crucial that the narrative isn't sanitized or romanticized to the point where the immense suffering he caused is overlooked. His son, Sebastián Marroquín, has tried to contribute to a more balanced understanding, acknowledging his father's crimes while also offering a unique, if obviously biased, perspective on the man behind the myth. He's spoken about the paranoia, the family life amidst chaos, and his own difficult journey coming to terms with his father's legacy. It's a complex, often contradictory picture. The story of Pablo Escobar serves as a stark reminder of the destructive power of the illegal drug trade, the corrosive effects of corruption, and the enduring human cost of violence. It's a chapter in Colombian history that is both incredibly dark and, in terms of how the country eventually fought back and began to rebuild, also a story of resilience. Ultimately, Pablo Escobar's life and death left an indelible mark on Colombia and the world. His reign of terror forced the Colombian state to its knees, but also, in a way, forced it to strengthen itself and its institutions to fight back. The very concept of narco-terrorism became globally understood through his actions. He demonstrated the terrifying potential of a criminal enterprise to wage war against a sovereign nation. The sheer scale of his operation, controlling an estimated 80% of the global cocaine market at his peak, was unprecedented and reshaped the drug trade for decades to come. Even though the Medellín Cartel collapsed after his death, the void was filled by others, showing that targeting kingpins alone isn't a silver bullet. The problem is far more systemic, tied to demand, poverty, corruption, and the immense profits involved. His legacy in Medellín is particularly complicated. While the city has undergone a remarkable transformation and is now celebrated for its innovation and resilience, the shadow of Escobar still looms. The narco tours and the lingering pockets of admiration in some of the poorer barrios he once helped stand, in stark contrast to the widespread condemnation of his brutality by the vast majority of Colombians, and the city's efforts to move forward. The barrio Pablo Escobar, still inhabited by people he housed, is a living testament to this divided memory. His impact on popular culture is undeniable, as we've discussed. He's become a modern-day folk villain, his story endlessly fascinating to people around the world. But it's so important to remember that behind the Narcos series and the dramatic tales, there were thousands of real victims. Police officers, judges, journalists, politicians, and countless innocent civilians, including the 107 people on Avianca Flight 203, blown up on his orders. Their stories are the true heart of the tragedy. The efforts of his son, Sebastián Marroquín, to seek reconciliation and apologize for his father's crimes are a unique part of this ongoing story, offering a different perspective from within the storm. He speaks of a father he loved, but whose actions he abhors, a duality that many find difficult to reconcile. What did the world learn? Perhaps it learned about the limits of prohibition, the power of illicit economies, and the extreme violence that can erupt when vast sums of money meet ruthless ambition in an environment of weak governance or social neglect. It also learned about the courage of ordinary Colombians and dedicated public servants who stood up to him, often at the cost of their own lives. People like Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán, and journalist Guillermo Cano Izaza, and countless unsung heroes in the police and judiciary. Their sacrifice is a critical counter-narrative to Escobar's infamy. The cocaine hippos roaming the Colombian countryside are perhaps the strangest, most tangible, and almost absurd living legacy he left behind. A quirky footnote to a brutal and bloody chapter. In the end, Pablo Escobar was a man who had it all: unimaginable wealth, power that rivaled governments. But he died a hunted man, barefoot on a rooftop, brought down by the very state he tried to destroy. His story is a dark epic, a testament to the depths of human cruelty and greed, but also to the resilience of a nation that refused to be permanently defined by him. And that, my friend, is the sprawling, complicated, and bloody tale of Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. Quite the journey, wasn't it? Well, after a journey like that, covering so much ground, from his humble beginnings to the height of his power and his violent end, it really makes you think, doesn't it? Pablo Escobar's shadow is a long one, and even now, decades after his death, people are still trying to make sense of it all. How could one man cause so much chaos, inspire such fear, and yet, for a small segment of the population, evoke a strange kind of loyalty? It's a question that historians, sociologists, and ordinary people continue to grapple with. His story isn't just about drugs and violence, it's also about power, corruption, social inequality, and the incredible resilience of a nation that faced him down. Colombia paid an enormous price, a price counted in thousands of lives lost and a national psyche scarred by years of terror. But it also showed an incredible capacity to heal and to rebuild. Think about Medellín today. It's a vibrant city, a hub of innovation, a place that actively works to overcome its past. That transformation is, in itself, a powerful counter-narrative to Escobar's legacy of destruction. It shows that even from the darkest chapters, societies can find a path towards a brighter future. The narco-culture that sometimes springs up around figures like Escobar is a tricky thing. It's easy to get caught up in the drama, the bad boy image, the almost unbelievable wealth. But it's so vital to remember the real victims, the families shattered, the journalists and public servants who risked and often lost their lives trying to uphold justice and tell the truth. Their courage is a huge part of this story, too, and perhaps the part that deserves the most attention. The global war on drugs continues to evolve, and the lessons from the Escobar era are still relevant. The demand for drugs in wealthy nations fuels the violence and corruption in producing and transit countries. Simply taking out kingpins, while sometimes necessary, doesn't solve the underlying problems. It's a complex web, and there are no easy answers. Pablo Escobar wanted to be remembered, to be legendary. And in a way, he got his wish, though probably not in the way he fully envisioned. He's a byword for a certain kind of extravagant criminality. But the hope is that he's also remembered as a lesson in what happens when ambition curdles into megalomania, and when the pursuit of wealth tramples all over human decency. It's a story that will likely be told and retold for generations, hopefully with an increasing focus on the broader context and the enduring human spirit that resisted and ultimately outlasted him. So, there you have it, a deep dive into a truly extraordinary and terrifying life. It's been quite the tale to unfold. If you've stuck with me through all of this, I really appreciate you listening. And hey, if you found this journey through history engaging, don't forget to hit that like button and maybe subscribe for more stories. It always helps to know folks are interested in these deep dives. Thanks for joining me on this one. Well, my friend, that really brings us to the end of our deep dive into the life and times of Pablo Escobar. We've journeyed through his entire story, from his early days right through to his death, and the long shadow his legacy casts. We've covered the rise of his empire, the reign of terror, the hunt, and the aftermath. I've tried to pack in as much detail as possible to give you the full picture, just as you asked. Is there perhaps a specific part of his story, or its impact that you're still pondering, or something you'd like to reflect on now that we've gone through it all? Otherwise, we've pretty much reached the end of this particular narrative path. It's been quite the chronicle to share,